When I came home, my neighbor complained, "Your house is so loud during the day." "That's impossible," I said. "No one should be home." "I heard someone shouting," she insisted. The next day, I pretended to leave for work and hid under the bed. Hours later, a voice entered my bedroom, and I froze. The air in the hospital waiting room was a chemical soup of antiseptic, stale coffee, and fear. It was a smell I knew too well. 3 years earlier, when I was 17, I'd been the one on the other side of the double doors, the subject of hushed, anxious conversations. I'd wrapped my first car around an old oak tree, a stupid, reckless act of teenage bravado. That time, the hospital had called my mother for consent for the surgery to pin my shattered leg back together. Her response, relayed to me later by a sympathetic nurse, had been chillingly pragmatic. "Let me know if he doesn't survive," she'd said. "I don't have time for paperwork." They had to call my grandfather, my dad's dad, who drove 6 hours through the night to be there, his signature on a form saving my leg and, quite possibly, my life. Now, the roles were reversed, but the chill was the same. It was my father, David, on the other side of those doors, and I was the one shivering in the waiting room, my arm in a sling from the same collision that had put him there. The accident had been a blur of screeching tires and shattering glass. A truck ran a red light, T-boned us on the passenger side, where Dad was sitting. I'd gotten away with a dislocated shoulder and a concussion. Dad was critical. The doctors used words like internal bleeding, multiple traumas, and prognosis guarded. Each phrase was a little stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. My mother, Eleanor, wasn't my biological mother. She was my stepmother, a woman who had entered our lives when I was 12, all polished smiles and designer handbags. She and my father had been married for 8 years. To the outside world, she was the perfect, doting wife. To me, she was a frost-covered window, beautiful, cold, and impossible to see through. She swept into the waiting room nearly 2 hours after my frantic call, not with the panicked rush of a worried wife, but with the annoyed stride of someone whose dinner plans had been inconvenienced. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. Her makeup was immaculate. Not a single tear track marred her foundation. "Leo, darling," she breathed, rushing to me and enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume. "Are you all right?" I came as soon as I heard. Her hand fluttered over my sling, a gesture of concern that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were scanning the room, assessing, calculating. "I'm fine," I mumbled, pulling away slightly. "It's Dad. It's bad, Eleanor." "Oh, I know, the poor dear," she said, her voice dripping with a syrupy sympathy that made my teeth ache. She sat beside me, her posture perfect, a stark contrast to my slumped, aching frame. We sat in silence for another hour, a silence punctuated by the overhead paging system and my own ragged breathing. I watched her. She checked her phone 3 times, her thumb scrolling with practiced speed. She reapplied her lipstick once. She sighed, a theatrical, put-upon sound. Finally, a doctor with exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes came through the doors. He looked at us, his gaze landing on Eleanor. "Misteris Hale?" he asked. "My father's name." Eleanor stood, all grace and gravity. "Yes. How is he? How is my David?" "He's stabilized for the moment," the doctor began, and a tiny knot of hope loosened in my chest, "but his spleen has ruptured, and he has significant internal hemorrhaging. We need to perform an emergency splenectomy, but given his other injuries and the trauma his body has sustained, it's a very high-risk procedure. There's a significant chance he won't survive the surgery. However," he added, holding up a hand, "without it, he will certainly die within the next few hours. We need consent to proceed." This was it, the moment of truth. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was 20, legally an adult, but she was his wife, his next of kin. The decision was hers. I looked at her, expecting, hoping to see the fear and love of a wife facing an impossible choice. Instead, I saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. A flicker of cold, hard opportunity. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. "Doctor," she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like manufactured grief. "My husband, David, he was a man of great dignity. He always said he never wanted to be kept alive by machines, to be a shadow of himself." The doctor looked confused. "Misteris Hale, this isn't about long-term life support. This is an acute, life-saving surgery." "I know," she whispered, a single perfect tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. "But the risk, you said he might not survive it. What would his quality of life be, even if he did, to put him through that pain, that trauma? I just can't. I can't do that to him." She looked the doctor straight in the eye. "I won't sign. Let nature take its course. It's what he would have wanted." The air left my lungs. The waiting room, with its sickly yellow light and sticky floors, seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" The word was a strangled croak. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? He needs the surgery. He'll die without it." She turned to me, her face a mask of sorrowful pity. "Leo, darling, you're in shock. You don't understand. Your father and I discussed this. He made his wishes very clear. This was a lie. A bald-faced, monstrous lie. My father loved life. He fought for everything. He would never, ever have given up." The doctor was horrified. "Misteris Hale, I must advise you, your husband's wishes, unless specified in a legally binding advance directive, which he does not have on file, are not the primary concern here. The primary concern is saving his life. Refusing this surgery is, in effect, a death sentence. My decision is final," she said, her voice now hard as steel beneath the velvet. "Do not operate. Make him comfortable." I scrambled to my feet, my injured arm screaming in protest. "No! You can't do this! He's my father! You can't just let him die!" I turned to the doctor, my voice cracking with desperation. "Isn't there any anything you can do? I'm his son. I consent. Do the surgery. The doctor gave me a pained, helpless look. I'm sorry, son. She's his wife. Legally, her decision overrides yours. My hands are tied. Eleanor placed a hand on my good arm. Leo, please, don't make this any harder than it already is. Her touch felt like a brand. I recoiled as if burned. The doctor, defeated and disgusted, retreated back through the double doors, taking my father's last chance with him. I collapsed back into the plastic chair, the world dissolving into a blurry, meaningless haze. Eleanor had just murdered my father, right here in this fluorescent-lit waiting room, and she had done it with a smile. She thought I was broken. She thought the shock and the concussion had rendered me inert, a grieving, helpless boy she could manage. She was wrong. As the initial tidal wave of horror receded, it left behind something cold and sharp, rage. I sat there, feigning a catatonic state, my mind racing. I needed a witness. I needed help. My phone was in my pocket. My fingers were clumsy, slick with sweat, but I managed to pull it out, keeping it low, below the armrest of the chair. I fumbled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over my Uncle Robert's name. Robert, my dad's younger brother. He was a retired cop, pragmatic and sharp, and he'd never trusted Eleanor. I hit the call button and let the phone slip down between the cushion and the side of the chair, the call connecting just as Eleanor began to speak. It's better this way, you know, she said, her voice losing its mournful tremor and taking on a conversational, almost placid tone. She thought she was talking to a shell-shocked child. She had no idea she was talking to a jury of one, with another listening on the line. He was in so much debt. The business was failing. You didn't know that, did you? He kept it from you, always trying to protect you. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on a water stain on the ceiling tile, letting my breathing remain shallow, my body limp. This accident, she continued, a strange emphasis on the word. It's a blessing, really. A clean break. The life insurance policy is substantial, very substantial. Enough to clear the debts and leave a comfortable nest egg. She paused, and I could feel her looking at me. For us, Leo, for our future. I'll take care of you, of course. You won't have to worry about a thing. My blood ran cold. The business wasn't failing. I helped Dad with the books on weekends. It was thriving. The debt she was talking about was a lie, a foundation she was laying for her story. It was getting so tiresome, she sighed, the sound utterly devoid of grief. The constant worrying about money he didn't have. The way he always put you first. Leo needs this. Leo's tuition. A new car for Leo. It was always about you. As if I didn't exist. Her voice was laced with a venomous resentment that I had only ever glimpsed before. Now it was pouring out, raw and undiluted. I tried to manage things, she went on, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A little something in his coffee to help him relax. Just herbs, you know. Natural things. To take the edge off his energy. He was always so vibrant. It was exhausting. But it was never enough. He was so stubborn, so strong. She laughed, a short, bitter sound that scraped against my raw nerves. Even his heart, strong as an ox. I read that those herbs, over time, can weaken the cardiac muscle. Make it more susceptible to shock. I suppose we'll never know, will we? The confession washed over me, wave after sickening wave. This wasn't just negligence. This wasn't a snap decision in a moment of panic. This was a plan. A long, patient, murderous plan. The accident hadn't been her doing, but she had laid the groundwork to ensure that if something like it ever happened, it would be fatal. She had been slowly, methodically poisoning my father for months, maybe years. And that DNR, she mused, almost to herself, so easy. A few clicks on a legal website, a little practice with his signature. I was going to file it with his doctor next week. This just sped up the timeline. It's almost poetic. She patted my knee, a gesture of grotesque intimacy. Now, all we have to do is wait. The doctors will make him comfortable. It will be peaceful, and then we can begin our new life. The double doors swung open again. It wasn't a doctor this time. It was my Uncle Robert. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, usually crinkling with humor, were narrowed slits. He took in the scene. Me, pale and slumped. Eleanor, perched beside me like a vulture. His gaze dropped to the floor, where the corner of my phone was just visible, wedged into the chair. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He had heard it all. Eleanor, he said, his voice a low rumble. What the hell is going on? I just spoke to Dr. Evans. He said you refused the surgery. Eleanor's composure was flawless. She rose, her face instantly transforming back into a mask of tragic widowhood. Robert, oh, thank God you're here. It's terrible. David, I know about David. He cut her off, his voice sharp. I'm asking you why you're letting him die. It's what he wanted, she cried, the performance starting up again. He never wanted to be kept alive by machines. That's bull, and you know it, Robert snarled. David was a fighter. He would never give up. He took a step closer, his presence seeming to suck the air out of the room. I was on the phone with Leo. I heard you, Eleanor. I heard every single word. For the first time, a crack appeared in her perfect facade. Her eyes widened, darting from Robert's stony face to my still form. The color drained from her cheeks. Heard what? I don't know what you're talking about. He's in shock. He's confused. He might be in shock, but my phone's recording function isn't, Robert said, his voice dangerously quiet. I heard about the life insurance. I heard about the herbs in his coffee. I heard about the forged DNR. I heard everything. Eleanor stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The mask was gone. In its place was pure, unadulterated panic. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw not a grieving boy, but the witness who had just heard her sign her own death warrant. Her face contorted with fury. You little bastard, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You were faking." "Get away from him," Robert ordered, stepping between us. He pulled out his own phone and dialed. "Yes, I need security in the surgical waiting room on the 3rd floor. And you'd better send a police officer, too. I'm detaining a woman here for, at minimum, criminal negligence, and what I suspect is attempted murder." Eleanor's panic curdled into a theatrical hysteria. "No, he's lying. They're conspiring against me. They want the money," she shrieked, just as 2 hospital security guards came jogging down the hall. They were large, no-nonsense men who looked unimpressed by her performance. Robert flashed his old badge and spoke to them in a low, authoritative voice. They flanked Eleanor, who had now dissolved into loud, sobbing protests. A few minutes later, a uniformed police officer arrived, and the scene became a surreal tableau of official procedure and raw emotion. As they led her away, still proclaiming her innocence and accusing us of being greedy liars, I finally let the facade drop. A wave of nausea and grief so profound, it felt like a physical blow slammed into me. My father was dying. He was dying just a few feet away, and the woman who had put on a show of loving him for years was the one who was killing him. The sterile, quiet waiting room was suddenly a crime scene. My father passed away 45 minutes later without ever regaining consciousness. The last sound he would have heard was not my voice, but the sound of his wife calmly explaining to his son how she had orchestrated his death. The 15 days that followed were a gray, featureless fog of grief and bureaucracy. My father's funeral was a strained, awful affair. Eleanor was out on bail, a fact that made my skin crawl. She had hired a high-powered, piranha-like lawyer who immediately began painting her as the grieving widow, unjustly accused by a volatile, greedy stepson and his thuggish ex-cop uncle. Half the family, the side that had always been dazzled by Eleanor's money and charm, believed her. They sent her flowers and casseroles. They looked at me and Robert with suspicion and pity, as if we were the ones who had lost our minds. The other half, Dad's side, rallied around us. My grandfather, his face a mask of sorrow, sat with me for hours, not saying much, just being a solid, comforting presence. Uncle Robert became my general. He handled the police, the district attorney, the funeral arrangements. He shielded me from the worst of it, treating the entire situation like his last, most important case. We met with the detective assigned to the case, a tired-looking man named Miller, and I recounted the story for what felt like the 100th time. Robert played him the recording from his phone. Miller listened intently, his expression grim. "It's a confession, no doubt about it," Miller said, rubbing his jaw. "But her lawyer's going to argue it was made under duress, that she was distraught, that it was a fantasy born of grief. They'll say you, Leo, were delirious from the concussion and that Robert coached you. They're going to try and tear you apart on the stand." We also hired our own lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Sarah, to handle the estate. Eleanor, as Dad's widow, was the executor and primary beneficiary of his will. She had immediately moved to freeze all his assets, effectively cutting me off from the life my father had built. Sarah explained the long, arduous process of contesting a will and proving undue influence, or, in this case, felonious action. If she is convicted of his murder or manslaughter, Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm, Slayer statutes prevent her from inheriting, but a conviction is a long way off. In the meantime, we fight to have her removed as executor. I began a grim, meticulous process. I started a journal, writing down every memory I could dredge up of Eleanor's strange behavior. The time she accidentally served Dad a dish she knew he was allergic to. The comments she'd make about his stress. The way she'd subtly isolate him from his old friends. Each memory was a tiny piece of a mosaic I hadn't been able to see until now. Robert and I spent a weekend in Dad's home office, a space Eleanor hadn't yet been allowed to touch thanks to an emergency order from Sarah. We sifted through years of financial documents looking for the failing business she'd described. We found the opposite. Records of healthy profits, smart investments, and a growing portfolio. What we also found were odd, unexplained withdrawals from a joint account, small amounts at first, then larger, all transferred to an account we didn't recognize. My life became a series of meetings, with Sarah, with Detective Miller, with the assistant district attorney. I saw a therapist, a kind woman who helped me process the dizzying combination of grief for my father and the trauma of Eleanor's betrayal. She taught me grounding techniques for the panic attacks that ambushed me in the middle of the night, the feeling of the car seat collapsing, the sound of shattering glass, the coldness in Eleanor's voice. The therapy, the legal strategy, the constant retelling of the story, it was my new reality, a grim, exhausting battle for the truth. Then, on the 15th day after my father's death, the doorbell rang at Eleanor's ridiculously opulent townhouse, the one she'd bought with my father's money. I know this because Uncle Robert had a friend, a private investigator, keeping a discreet watch on her. It was a man in a dark suit, holding a briefcase, not a lawyer, not a friend. He was Detective Miller. He wasn't alone. Several other officers were with him, along with a team from the medical examiner's office. Eleanor, according to Robert's contact, opened the door with a practiced, sorrowful look on her face, ready to perform for whoever was there. But when Detective Miller identified himself and handed her the warrant, her face went white. It wasn't an arrest warrant, not yet. It was a search warrant for the premises. And it was accompanied by another legal document, one that caused her to become, in the PI's words, completely hysterical. It was an exhumation order for my father's body. Her lawyer had been fighting it tooth and nail, but the DA, armed with Robert's recording and the preliminary financial discrepancies we'd found, had convinced a judge. They were going to perform a full, detailed autopsy and toxicology screening. They were going to look for the herbs she had so casually mentioned, the herbs she thought would never be found. The hysteria wasn't grief. It was the terror of a killer who had just realized she hadn't buried her secrets deep enough. Eleanor's frantic, screaming reaction was exactly what Detective Miller had hoped for. It was the reaction of a guilty person. Her lawyer arrived and tried to shut it down, but the warrants were ironclad. As the police began their methodical search of her house, confiscating her computer, her phone, and boxes of documents, Eleanor could only watch, her mask of the grieving widow shattered into a million pieces. The foundation of her lies was beginning to crumble, and the sight of that man in a suit on her doorstep was the first tremor. The search of Eleanor's house was a goldmine. Tucked away in a decorative box in her closet, they found several vials of a liquid labeled as a natural heart supplement. It wasn't a common herbal remedy. It was a concentrated form of oleandrin, a potent cardiac glycoside derived from the oleander plant. It was tasteless, odorless, and when administered in small doses over a long period, it slowly weakened the heart muscle, making it prone to arrhythmia and failure under stress. It was a poisoner's perfect weapon. They also found her browser history, filled with searches like subtle poisons that mimic heart disease, how to forge a signature digitally, and legal challenges to spousal inheritance. On a thumb drive, they found the draft of the DNR form she'd mentioned, the one she was practicing my father's signature on. It was a digital smoking gun. While the police built their criminal case, Sarah and I pushed forward on the civil front. We filed a motion to have Eleanor removed as the executor of my father's estate, citing the ongoing criminal investigation and the clear conflict of interest. Her lawyers fought back with a viciousness that took my breath away. They filed a response that was a masterclass in character assassination. It painted me as a mentally unstable, drug-addled delinquent, still bitter about my father remarrying. They dredged up my accident at 17, twisting it from a stupid teenage mistake into a pattern of reckless, attention-seeking behavior. They claimed I had a history of psychiatric problems, that I was prone to fantasies and delusions. They alleged that my Uncle Robert, a disgruntled former police officer with a grudge against Eleanor, was manipulating me to get his hands on the family money. Reading that document felt like being physically assaulted. Every vulnerability, every mistake, every private moment of grief or anger I had ever shown was twisted and weaponized against me. They were trying to discredit me so thoroughly that no jury, civil or criminal, would ever believe a word I said. The family members who had sided with Eleanor amplified the narrative. I received sanctimonious calls from cousins and aunts, urging me to stop this madness and let your poor father rest in peace. They told me I was dishonoring his memory, that Eleanor was a mess, and that my vendetta was tearing the family apart. The pressure was immense. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare, and for a while, it worked. I hit my rock bottom about a month into the legal battle. I was sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and unopened mail. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Eleanor's voice, her calm, chilling confession. Then I would hear the voices of my relatives telling me I was crazy, that I was the problem. The doubt began to creep in. A toxic black sludge. What if they were right? What if the concussion had scrambled my brain? What if I had imagined the whole thing? A horrible, grief-fueled hallucination. I started to question my own memory, my own sanity. I felt myself slipping, losing the will to fight. It seemed so much easier to just give up, to let her have the money, to disappear and try to forget. The temptation to just walk away, to let the lies win, was overwhelming. I was staring at the wall, feeling the pull of that despair, when my phone rang. It was Uncle Robert. I almost didn't answer. "Leo," he said, his voice firm. "Get dressed. I'm picking you in 10. He didn't ask, he commanded. He took me to a diner, sat me down in a booth, and ordered me a coffee. He looked at me, his eyes seeing right through my exhausted facade. "They're getting to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "They're making me feel like I'm the crazy one. Maybe I am." Robert leaned forward, his big hands wrapped around his mug. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "This is what they do. This is the abuser's playbook. Chapter 1. Convince the victim they're insane. Eleanor is a predator, and her lawyers are her attack dogs. They are trying to break you because they know your testimony is the thing that can put her away for good. They are afraid of you, Leo. Don't you ever forget that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a preliminary report from the medical examiner. "Read this," he said. I unfolded it. It was full of technical jargon, but one line stood out, highlighted in yellow. "Significant cardiotoxicity consistent with long-term exposure to an unprescribed cardiac glycoside, likely oleandrin." My breath hitched. It was real. The herbs, the poison, it was all real. It wasn't a fantasy. It was right there, in black and white, a scientific validation of the horror I had witnessed. "They found it, Leo," Robert said softly. softly. They found the poison in his system. You are not crazy. You are the only one who told the truth. That piece of paper was the lifeline I needed. It pulled me out of the pit of despair and solidified my resolve. The doubt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The fight was no longer just about justice for my father. It was about my own vindication. It was about proving that what I had experienced was real. I would not let her gaslight me into silence. This evidentiary turning point galvanized our entire team. With the toxicology report, the DEA felt confident enough to convene a grand jury. Sarah used the report in civil court to successfully argue for Eleanor's immediate removal as executor of the estate. The judge appointed a neutral third-party administrator, freezing Eleanor out from the money she had killed for. It was a huge victory. Her financial power, her primary weapon of coercion, had been neutralized. Eleanor, predictably, did not take this well. Deprived of the estate's funds, she began a new campaign of harassment. She would have her concerned relatives call me at all hours. She tried to bribe a former friend of mine from high school to testify that I had a history of lying and drug use. The friend, to his credit, recorded the conversation and immediately turned it over to Detective Miller, adding witness tampering to Eleanor's growing list of potential charges. Her desperation was making her sloppy. The investigative process was a slow, grinding machine. Detective Miller and his team meticulously built their case, piece by piece. They interviewed dozens of people, family, friends, my father's business partners, former employees. They subpoenaed pharmacy records and credit card statements, tracing Eleanor's purchase of the herbal supplement from a shady online store based overseas. They created a timeline that showed her escalating financial withdrawals, her incriminating internet searches, and her attempts to isolate my father, all leading up to the day of the accident. The strategic decisions made by the assistant DA, a determined woman named Cardenas, were critical. She decided against trying to prove Eleanor caused the car accident itself. There was no evidence for that. Instead, she built the case around a charge of murder in the first degree, arguing that by systematically poisoning my father over a long period, Eleanor had created the condition, a weakened heart, that directly led to his death from the trauma of the accident. It was a complex legal argument, but it was supported by the evidence. The backup charges were manslaughter, criminal neglect, forgery, and financial fraud. We're going to throw the book at her, Cardenas told us in a strategy meeting. We'll make sure that even if the jury balks at first-degree murder, she will not walk out of that courtroom a free woman. Protecting me as their star witness was her top priority. My therapist worked with me and Cardenas on how to handle the inevitable brutal cross-examination. We practiced. I learned to answer only the question asked, to not get drawn into arguments, to stay calm and centered. My therapist taught me to focus on the feeling of my feet on the floor, to control my breathing, to anchor myself in the present moment when the trauma threatened to overwhelm me. I was preparing not just for a legal battle, but for a psychological war. The months leading up to the trial were a strange limbo. Life was on hold. I was living on a modest stipend approved by the court-appointed administrator, just enough to cover my rent and bills. I felt like a character in a story that someone else was writing. The trial date was set, a day that loomed on the calendar like a mountain I had to climb. Eleanor, through her lawyers, made one last, desperate offer, a plea bargain. She would plead guilty to criminal neglect in exchange for a short sentence, and she would give up all claims to the estate. Cardenas presented the offer to me and Robert. It's a guaranteed conviction, she said. No risk of a jury letting her walk. I looked at Robert. His face was unreadable. I thought about my father. I thought about Eleanor's calm, chilling voice in the hospital. A short sentence for criminal neglect was not justice. It was an insult. No, I said, my voice clear and steady. No deal. We're going to trial. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the light. Eleanor sat at the defense table, looking thin and wan. She was dressed in a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back severely. She had transformed herself from a glamorous socialite into a frail, beleaguered victim. Her eyes met mine for a brief second across the room, and they were filled with a cold, reptilian hatred. There was no remorse. There was only fury that she had been caught. The trial unfolded over 2 long, grueling weeks. The prosecution, led by A.D.A. Cardenas, methodically laid out their case. They started with the first responders and the emergency room doctor, who testified about my father's condition and Eleanor's shocking refusal of life-saving surgery. The doctor was unequivocal. Her decision was a death sentence, he stated, his voice firm. They put the forensic accountant on the stand, who walked the jury through the complex web of financial transfers Eleanor had made, siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from my father's accounts into her own secret ones. Then came the computer forensics expert, who detailed her incriminating search history. With each new piece of evidence, I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shift. The jury, a panel of ordinary men and women, were beginning to see the real Eleanor beneath the fragile facade. The most damning testimony came from the chief medical examiner. He explained, in clear, simple terms, how the oleandrin had systematically damaged my father's heart. Mr. Hale's injuries from the collision were severe, but they were not necessarily fatal, he concluded. In a healthy man of his age, the chances of survival, while not guaranteed, would have been significantly higher. However, his heart was already in a severely compromised state due to chronic poisoning. It simply could not withstand the shock of the trauma and the subsequent internal bleeding. In my professional opinion, the poisoning was a direct and substantial contributing factor to his death. Finally, it was my turn to testify. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. My heart pounded in my ears. I sat down, my hands clammy. I focused on my feet, planted firmly on the floor, just as my therapist had taught me. Cardenas led me through my story gently. I recounted the events of the accident, the conversation in the waiting room, Eleanor's confession. I spoke about her lies regarding the business, the subtle cruelties, the feeling I'd always had that something was wrong. My voice was steady. I did not cry. I simply told the truth. Then came the cross-examination. Eleanor's lawyer, a man named Peterson with a predatory smile, approached the stand. He started softly, his voice full of feigned sympathy. He asked about my concussion, about the medication I was given in the hospital. He was laying the groundwork to suggest my memory was unreliable. "Mr. Hale," he said, his tone shifting, "isn't it true that you had a difficult relationship with your stepmother? That you resented her for replacing your biological mother?" "My mother passed away when I was 6, I said calmly. "Eleanor married my father 6 years later. I didn't resent her. I was wary of her." "Wary or hostile?" he pressed. "Isn't it true you were a troubled teenager? That at 17 you stole your father's car and crashed it, causing significant property damage and costing your father a small fortune in legal fees?" "I made a stupid mistake when I was 17, I replied, looking directly at the jury. "I took the car without permission. I wasn't trying to steal it. My father and I worked through it. It has nothing to do with what happened to him." Peterson paced back and forth. "Let's talk about what you claim happened in the hospital. You were suffering from a concussion. You were given painkillers. And you expect this jury to believe that in this state, you perfectly recall a long, detailed confession from a woman who was overcome with grief?" "She wasn't overcome with grief," I said, my voice level. "She was calm. She was calculating. She was relieved." "Relieved?" Peterson scoffed. "Or is it that you were the one who was calculating? Is it not true, Mr. Hale, that you knew your father's will named Mr. S. Hale as the primary beneficiary? That you were furious about this? That you and your uncle concocted this fantastical story to frame her and seize the inheritance for yourselves?" The accusation hung in the air. This was the moment, the pivot point. I could feel the anger rising in me, the hot, righteous fury. But I remembered my therapist's words. "Anchor yourself. Don't let him control your emotions." I took a slow breath. "No, sir," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That is not true. My Uncle Robert recorded her confession on his phone because what she was saying was so monstrous he knew no one would believe it otherwise. I am not here for money. I am here because she murdered my father. She told me how she did it, and I will not rest until there is justice for him." I held Peterson's gaze, and for the first time, I saw his smug confidence waver. He had tried to break me, and he had failed. He asked a few more half-hearted questions and then returned to his seat, defeated. The prosecution rested its case. The defense's case was brief and weak. They put a few of the enabling family members on the stand to testify about how devastated Eleanor was, but their testimony wilted under Cardenas's sharp cross-examination. Eleanor herself did not testify. Her lawyers knew that putting her on the stand, where she would have to face Cardenas, was a risk they couldn't take. After the closing arguments, the jury filed out. The wait was agony. Every minute felt like an hour. Uncle Robert sat beside me, his hand a heavy, reassuring weight on my shoulder. We didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. After 6 hours, the bailiff came back. "We have a verdict." My whole body went rigid. We all stood as the jury filed back in, their faces grim and unreadable. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, handed a paper to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," the judge read, his voice echoing in the stillness. "How do you find?" The foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Eleanor Hale, not guilty." A gasp went through the courtroom. My stomach plummeted. Eleanor's lawyer squeezed her shoulder. I felt a wave of nausea, the bitter taste of defeat. It was all for nothing. "However," the judge continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "on the lesser included charge of manslaughter in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman took a breath. "We find the defendant guilty." A sob escaped Eleanor's lips, a raw, ugly sound. "On the charge of forgery in the second degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of grand larceny and financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty." It was a cascade of victories. They hadn't been able to agree on the premeditation required for first-degree murder, but they had agreed on everything else. They believed me. They believed the evidence. They saw her for what she was. It wasn't the absolute justice I had craved, the clean, satisfying conviction for murder. It was messy. It was partial, but it was real. The sentencing was 3 weeks later. Eleanor, stripped of her designer suits and her composure, stood before the judge as he delivered a blistering condemnation of her actions. He spoke of her monstrous greed and chilling lack of remorse. He sentenced her to the maximum allowable for each charge, to be served consecutively. 25 years to life for the manslaughter, with additional years for the other crimes. With parole, she would be a very old woman before she ever saw the outside of a prison again. She was led away in handcuffs, finally and irrevocably defeated. The aftermath of the trial was not an explosion of relief, but a quiet, slow exhale. The war was over, but the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of my life. The legal victory was profound, but it didn't bring my father back. It was a bittersweet verdict, a brand of justice that was real but incomplete. In a therapy session a week after the sentencing, I struggled to articulate this feeling. I won, I told my therapist. So why doesn't it feel like a total victory? Because a trial can only punish the guilty, she said gently. It can't heal the wounded. The verdict was the end of her story, Leo. It's the beginning of yours. Your victory isn't what happened to her in that courtroom. It's what you do now. Her words stuck with me. The process of rebuilding was slow and deliberate. The court-appointed administrator, with the civil case now resolved in my favor due to the Slayer statute, finally turned over control of my father's estate to me. The first thing I did was sell the house Eleanor and my father had shared. I couldn't set foot in it. It was tainted by her presence, by the memory of her slow, patient betrayal. I sold her jewelry, her clothes, her car, all the trappings of the life she had built on lies, and donated the money to a victim advocacy group. I kept my father's business. It was the one piece of him that felt untouched by her. I immersed myself in it, learning the ropes, finding a sense of purpose in maintaining the legacy he had built. I kept the old family home, the one I grew up in before Eleanor, the one my grandfather now lived in. It was full of good memories, a sanctuary from the darkness of the past few years. Establishing boundaries was the hardest and most necessary part of my recovery. I wrote a single, brief email to the relatives who had sided with her, the ones who had called me crazy and cruel. I told them that while I hoped they would one day understand the truth, I could not have them in my life. I blocked their numbers and social media profiles. It was a painful but liberating act of self-preservation. My life had a new, non-negotiable rule: no enablers allowed. My circle became smaller, but it was solid. It was just me, Uncle Robert, my grandfather, and a few trusted friends who had stood by me through it all. Healing isn't a straight line. There are still days when the anger is a living thing inside me. There are nights when I wake up from nightmares of the accident, of the hospital waiting room. The scars are permanent, but they are no longer open wounds. They are part of the map of who I am now. A few weeks ago, I found an old photo while cleaning out a closet. It was of me and Dad, taken on a fishing trip when I was about 15. We're both grinning, holding up a ridiculously small fish, the sun setting over the lake behind us. He has his arm around my shoulder, his smile so full of life and uncomplicated love, it almost hurts to look at. For a long time, my memory of him was tainted by the manner of his death. But looking at that photo, I realized I was finally starting to remember him for the way he lived. I've put the photo on my desk, right next to my computer. It's a reminder of what was real, what was true, long before Eleanor's poison ever entered our lives. The justice system gave me a partial victory, but reclaiming my father's memory, that's a victory I have to win for myself every day. My new life is quieter, more deliberate. It's a life built on a foundation of hard-won truth. It's not the life I would have chosen, but it is, finally, mine. And honestly, after everything, it's all a bit absurd, isn't it? The sheer operatic villainy of it all. If you wrote it in a book, people would say it was too unbelievable. A stepmother slowly poisoning her husband with exotic plant extracts and forging legal documents. It sounds like something out of a daytime soap opera, but it was my life. It was my Tuesday. If you've stuck with me through this whole insane saga, from the hospital waiting room to the final gavel, well, you deserve a medal, or at least a very strong cup of coffee. It's been a long road, and telling it all is its own kind of marathon. But hey, if you can listen to a story this long and this messed up, you can probably handle anything. You should probably subscribe. You never know what other unbelievable truths are waiting to be told.